Good evening. I'm here to provide you with the second part of our message on the Friday of Jesus' last week, that Friday which we call Good Friday. In the first part of Sunday's message, we walked through the events of Jesus' death on Friday, examined some of the details, looked at his death, and offered an alternate reason for his death. That being a final confrontation with Roman imperial authority and the local religious collaborators. That in his challenge of the empire's unjust domination system and the temple's collaboration with the empire's oppression and exploitation of the people, that of course he would be killed. Because as we have established a few times during Lent, those who fight and speak for justice are often crucified. And Jesus did just that. He spoke and fought for God's justice, God's kingdom to be manifest on earth in the lives of God's people. Today, in part 2 of our message on Good Friday, we want to return to that primary accepted reason for Jesus' death. That being, he was the substitutionary sacrifice needed for the world's sins. The word sacrifice, though, carries with it two meanings, and it is important to note the difference between those meanings. One is a broad meaning with a wide range, the other, a specific meaning with a narrow scope. The first is sacrificing one's life for a cause. Think of Dr. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Oscar Romero, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the women and men on the front lines fighting the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. They have all sacrificed their lives or are putting their lives at risk for a cause they are devoted to, something they believe in. In this sense, Jesus sacrificed his life for his passion, his advocacy for that of the kingdom of God and God's justice. In a specific sense of the meaning of sacrifice, we speak of Jesus' death as a substitutionary sacrifice for sin. That is, he died for the sins of the world. However, this particular understanding is not found in Mark's telling of the events of Good Friday. It just isn't there. Nor is it found anywhere in Mark's Gospel. The three prophecies or anticipations of Jesus' death that he speaks of with his disciples mention nothing about Jesus dying for the sins of the world in Jerusalem. Rather, Jerusalem is simply the place where the authorities carry out executions. But there is one verse in Mark that may have a substitutionary sacrificial meaning. Mark 10:45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The word ransom sure does sound like it has some sacrificial meaning. We often speak of Jesus as a ransom for many. However, ransom does not have this meaning in Mark. Ransom is translated from the Greek word lutron. Lutron is not used to refer to a payment for, but rather a payment made to liberate captives, such as those held captive at war, or slaves, mostly from debt slavery. Lutron is a means of liberation from bondage. Jesus giving his life as a ransom for many meant he gives his life as the means for liberation from bondage. In the context of the surrounding verses and all of Mark's gospel, this makes sense, as Jesus often criticizes the domination system, both imperial and local, those rulers, leaders, tyrants, who oppress and exploit the people. It is, however, not to be this way among his disciples and his followers. In using his own path as an illustration, Jesus says he came to serve, not to be served, and to give his life as a lutron, a means of liberation for all in bondage. It is the path that Jesus' followers are to imitate. It is how things are to be among them. Lutron, giving one's life as the means for liberation of those in bondage. This is the path Jesus's followers are expected to follow. Mark then does not see Jesus' death as substitutionary sacrifice for sin. How does he see it? Mark sees Jesus' death as an execution by the authorities because Jesus challenged their injustice, abuse of power, and their domination system of oppression and exploitation. The temple authorities act because of Jesus' disruption in the temple, his temple tantrum. Remember, he overturned tables, chased out the buyers and sellers, and declared, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and scribes begin seeking a way to kill him based upon these actions and words. The local collaborators hand him over to imperial authorities who crucify him on the charge that he was king of the Jews, when for the Romans there was only one king, the emperor. For Mark, Jesus' death is a judgment on the authorities in the temple because it was the chief priests, the elders, the scribes who arranged to have Jesus killed, just as he said they would. The judgment is seen in the looming darkness that hangs over the sky for 3 hours on Friday. The judgment is seen when the curtain is torn in two. Judgment is heard when a Roman centurion speaks against his own empire and declares that Jesus is the Son of God, not the emperor. A question Borg and Crossan raised in their book the last week is this: did Jesus' death have to happen? Did Jesus have to die? There are two reasons that may lead us to think so. One is divine necessity. Two is human inevitability. Divine necessity asks if Jesus' death happened because of God's will. Such a question has something to teach us about Good Friday. By the time Mark had written his gospel, early Christianity had already developed many interpretations surrounding Jesus' death. All are purposeful and providential. Through Jesus' death, God has accomplished something of great value. All interpretations surrounding Jesus' death are retrospective and retrojective, that is, projecting into the past. They look back on Jesus' death and see purpose in it. Purpose that had not occurred to Jesus' followers. Purpose that was retrojected into the story. And purpose that reasons Jesus' death had to happen. In their discussion surrounding the events of Friday, Borg and Crossan ask if concluding that Jesus' death had to happen is the right conclusion or a necessary one. An interesting question, to be sure, if not a challenging one. Such a question invites us to look at a story in Genesis, a story that spans all of chapters 37 through 50. It is the story of Joseph and his brothers, the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and he ends up in Egypt. In Egypt, Joseph rises in power and authority to become Pharaoh's right-hand man. Famine strikes Canaan, and the brothers come to Egypt looking for aid. The brothers, though, don't know Joseph has become the second most powerful man in Egypt. They think he's dead. Joseph meets with them, and they are afraid. Joseph, whom they sold into slavery, now has power over them to determine whether they live or die. Joseph, with his power and authority, can do whatever he chooses. Joseph, though, is not vengeful. For as we find in Genesis 45, 5 through 7, his brothers did not send him to Egypt. God did. Joseph says, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors." Was it God's will for Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery? No, that is never God's will. It is not, nor is it ever, God's will for anyone to be sold into slavery. Did this story have to happen this way? No. It could have happened differently. It could have happened in all sorts of ways. The brothers didn't have to sell Joseph into slavery. Joseph didn't have to help his brothers. The way this story reads is an example of retrospectively retrojecting purpose into the story, especially in light of Joseph's response. It doesn't mean we have to think of this as God's will or that it had to happen this way. Rather, this story affirms that even the evil deed of selling your brother into slavery can be used by God for a providential purpose. God, being God, can make great good come out of even the worst situations. How does this story affect how we view the story of Good Friday, the story of Jesus' death? Was Jesus' death the will of God? No. It is not, nor is it ever, God's will for a righteous man to be crucified. Did it have to happen this way? No. It could have happened differently. It could have happened in all sorts of ways. Judas did not have to betray Jesus. The temple authorities could have chosen another course of action. Pilate could have released Jesus. Peter did not have to deny Jesus. The disciples could have stayed with Jesus in the garden rather than flee and abandon him. But Good Friday happened the way it did, and Jesus died the way he did. And Christian storytellers, looking back at these events, see providential meaning and purpose in the events of Friday. But that doesn't mean Good Friday had to happen. It doesn't mean Jesus had to die. Another reason, though, tells us that Jesus' death was inevitable, not because of divine necessity, but because of human inevitability. Executions like that of Jesus are what empires do. They are what domination systems do. They are what tyrants do to people who challenge them. It happened then, and it happens now. It happened to Jesus. It happened to John the Baptist when Herod had him arrested and beheaded. It happened to Paul, Peter, and James. Those who speak and fight for God's justice and God's kingdom are often crucified. What was it about Jesus and his movement that provoked these authorities so much? Jesus isn't just the victim of a domination system. Jesus is a protagonist, the hero of the story, if you will. Jesus is filled with passion for the kingdom of God, passion for God's justice. He spoke as the voice for peasants, providing a voice of religious protest against the economic and political institutions of his day. He attracted followers galore and took his movement to Jerusalem for the Passover, where he challenged the authorities in public from Palm Sunday to Good Friday, in full view of everyone. This was his passion for God, God's kingdom, and God's justice. Jesus' passion got him killed. Jesus' passion for the kingdom of God led to what is called his passion. That is his suffering and death. To restrict his passion to the events of Friday, to his suffering and death, ignores the passion that brought him to Jerusalem. It separates his death from the passion that intensely animated his life. Did Good Friday have to happen? As a divine necessity? No. As a human inevitability? Yes. What happened on Good Friday is the result of collision between Jesus' passion and the domination systems and empire of his time. What killed Jesus was nothing unusual, though, despite how we might see it today. The temple authorities were not wicked people, and as far as empires go, Rome was a lot better than others. They had running water and public sewage. There was nothing exceptional or abnormal about Jesus' death. It was, after all, how domination systems and empires behaved. Borg and Crossan take to calling the domination system the normalcy of civilization. That's how common it was. Good Friday is the passion of Jesus colliding with the normalcy of civilization. While Mark's gospel does not lead us to believe Jesus died for the sins of the world, it does lead us to believe that Jesus died because of the sins of the world. The sins of injustice, greed, oppression, exploitation, the sins of domination, collaboration, collusion. Jesus died because of those sins. It was the injustice of a domination system that killed him, the injustice of local collaborators that killed him, injustice so routine it was commonplace. While sin is a much more expansive list, that list certainly includes sins such as these. Jesus died because of the sins of the world. Sins that still exist in our world today. Perhaps the bigger question surrounding Jesus' death is if he was guilty or innocent. He was charged with a crime, the crime being that he was king of the Jews. Was he guilty of said crime, or was he innocent? As Mark tells the story, Jesus was executed by crucifixion, that gruesome method reserved for persons such as violent insurrectionists. Jesus was crucified between two bandits or lestes, violent insurrectionists. Was Jesus guilty of advocating for violent insurrection and revolution against the empire and its collaborators? No. Was Jesus guilty of claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? Maybe. Jesus didn't teach this about himself, but Mark's account of the conversation between him and the high priest is ambiguous. Remember that I am is from the Greek ego iemi, which can be declarative or interrogative. I am or am I? Maybe Jesus was guilty of making such a claim. Maybe he wasn't. Was Jesus guilty of non-violently resisting the Roman imperial oppression and the collaboration of the local Jewish religious leaders? Was Jesus guilty of that? Oh, yes. Mark's story of Jesus' last week is a sequence of public demonstrations against and confrontations with the domination system, local and imperial. And it killed him. Story over. The end.